Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., the owl landed on the same branch outside her bedroom window. It didn't hoot, it didn't move, it didn't hunt. It watched. The girl never noticed it at first. She slept with her back to the window, one arm curled under her pillow, breathing unevenly the way she had since the funeral. The house was quiet in that fragile way grief creates. No television, no music, no voices left arguing in the kitchen. Just absence. The owl tilted its head slightly, adjusting to the glow of the streetlight below. One eye remained fixed on the glass. The other scanned the room, memorizing details it already knew too well. The crack in the ceiling paint, the chair where clothes piled instead of being folded, the small nightlight shaped like a moon that stayed on because darkness felt too final now. The owl had not chosen this body, it had accepted it. Feathers replaced hands. Talons replaced fingers that once brushed hair away from her face when she had nightmares. The weight of flight replaced the weight of responsibility, but not the memory of it. Inside the owl's chest, something human remained intact. Recognition. The girl shifted in her sleep and whispered a name into the pillow. His name. The owl did not react, not because it didn't understand, but because reacting was forbidden. There were rules to borrowed bodies, rules no one explained, rules learned through instinct and consequence. He could observe, he could follow, he could remain, but he could not touch. He could not speak. He could not reveal himself. Not yet. Tonight was not the night. The owl's wings flexed once, silently, as if resisting the urge to move closer. Dawn was still hours away. He would stay until the first hint of blue crept into the sky, until it was time to disappear again. Because this wasn't about haunting. It was about guarding something fragile until it learned how to exist without him. And every night he returned, not to be seen, but to make sure she was still breathing. Before this story continues, subscribe to Borrowed Bodies. This channel tells stories about lives that didn't fully end, about people who return in borrowed forms to finish something they couldn't complete the first time. And while you're listening, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. These stories travel quietly, but they reach people everywhere. This is not a story about superstition or fantasy. It's about attachment that refuses to dissolve. The father in this story did not return because he was unfinished in a dramatic sense. He returned because something essential remained unresolved, not guilt, not regret, but presence. The kind of presence that once filled a room without effort and vanished too suddenly to be replaced. His daughter did not ask for signs. She did not pray for miracles. After the funeral, she learned to survive by shrinking her expectations. She slept, she woke, she went to school, she answered questions she didn't feel. What she didn't know was that her nights were no longer empty. Borrowed bodies do not arrive with intention. They arrive with instinct, a pull toward what mattered most, even when the mind that remembers it no longer belongs to a human form. The owl outside her window did not come to change fate. It came to observe, to protect, and to wait. There are limits to what a borrowed body can do. It cannot interfere directly. It cannot rewrite outcomes. It cannot demand recognition. It can only stay close. This story unfolds quietly, through repetition, through nights that look identical from the outside, through moments no one would think to question. Nothing supernatural announces itself. No voice breaks the silence. No message is delivered in words. Instead, meaning accumulates the way grief does, slowly, invisibly, until one small shift changes everything. This is a story about watching instead of acting, about love that accepts distance as its final form, and about the cost of staying when leaving would be easier, because the owl does not return every night forever. It returns until the moment it is no longer needed, and that moment is closer than anyone realizes. The girl began waking at night without knowing why. It wasn't fear. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a sensation, subtle, persistent, like being watched in a way that didn't feel threatening. Her eyes would open slowly, unfocused, adjusting to the dark room where nothing ever moved, nothing human at least. She would stare at the ceiling for a few seconds, listening to the house breathe, pipes ticking, wind brushing against the siding, the quiet hum of a world that kept functioning even after someone essential had been removed from it. Then she would turn. The window sat slightly open every night, just enough to let air circulate. Her mother insisted on it, saying stale air made sleep heavier, more difficult. The curtain shifted gently with each draft, never dramatic, never still, and outside, just beyond the glass, the owl remained. At first her eyes didn't register it as unusual. Her brain categorized it as part of the night, like the street light or the tree branches that scraped together softly. But over time, something in her noticed consistency. The owl was always there, same branch, same angle, same stillness. It never startled when she moved, never flinched when headlights passed below. It didn't behave like the other animals she had seen from her window before. Cats wandered, birds fluttered, everything reacted. The owl endured. She began sitting up in bed, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The moon-shaped nightlight cast a faint glow across the room, enough to reflect off the glass and briefly obscure the outside world. The owl waited. Inside the bird, memory stirred in fragments rather than images. Sensations without language, the rhythm of her breathing, the particular way she frowned in sleep, the instinct to count her breaths when they grew uneven. He remembered doing that, in another body, in another life. The owl's talons tightened slightly around the branch, not from tension but restraint. Every instinct screamed to move closer, to tap the glass, to announce presence. But borrowed bodies were not granted permission. They were granted proximity. That was the trade. During the day, the girl spoke less. Her teachers noted it gently, writing comments about adjustment and sensitivity. Friends tried to include her, then slowly learned not to push. Grief had changed her posture, the way she occupied space. At night, she whispered. Sometimes it was nothing more than a sound, half a word, unfinished. Sometimes it was his name, not loud enough to wake herself, but loud enough to echo in the space between worlds. The owl heard every instance. He catalogued them without intending to. The nights she said his name twice. The nights she didn't say it at all. The nights she cried silently, eyes open, staring directly at him without seeing. Those nights were the hardest. Borrowed bodies carried limitations that went beyond silence. Emotion itself was filtered. He could feel urgency without release, love without expression, recognition without response. Still, he returned, each night at 2:17 a.m., without fail, until the night something changed. The girl sat up faster than usual, breath catching. She rubbed her eyes, then looked directly at the window. This time, she didn't look through the owl. She looked at it. Their gazes aligned, human and borrowed, child and father, separated by glass and form. The owl remained perfectly still, understanding immediately what this moment represented. Recognition was dangerous. Her brow furrowed, confusion overtaking sleepiness. She leaned closer to the window, close enough for her breath to fog the glass slightly. "Dad?" she whispered, not as a question but as a reflex. The owl's wings twitched. Not enough to be obvious. Enough to matter. Something ancient and inflexible reacted instantly, a pressure, not pain, but warning, pressed against the borrowed body, reminding him of the rules he had already broken by being noticed. The owl did not move again. The girl waited. Nothing happened. Eventually, logic returned. She shook her head slightly, embarrassed by the thought, and lay back down, pulling the blanket to her chin. The owl remained until dawn. But the boundary had shifted. And once recognition begins, borrowed bodies do not remain unnoticed for long. After that night, the owl adjusted nothing and everything. It still arrived at 2:17 a.m. It still chose the same branch. It still watched without sound. But attention had shifted. The girl no longer slept as deeply. She woke more often, not startled, not afraid, just alert, as if some internal clock had synchronized with something outside herself. When her eyes opened now, they searched immediately. And each time, the owl was there. She didn't tell her mother. Grief had already made adults fragile around her. She had learned that certain thoughts, once spoken aloud, invited concern instead of comfort. This felt like something she needed to hold carefully until she understood it herself. She began sitting at the window during the day, studying the branch. It was thick, old, scarred by weather. Leaves clustered around it unevenly, creating a pocket of shadow. From the ground below, the branch looked unremarkable. At night it became an anchor. The owl sensed her awareness the way a person senses when their name is being said behind them. It didn't need eyes on the window to know she was awake. Her attention pressed outward, brushing against him even through the glass. That awareness carried weight. Borrowed bodies were meant to observe without consequence. Recognition complicated the exchange. The rules didn't forbid being seen, but they discouraged it. Visibility shortened time. He understood this instinctively. Still, he didn't leave. During the day, the owl remained hidden. It slept in the hollow of a nearby tree, wings folded tight, conserving energy that didn't feel physical. Hunger came and went, irrelevant. The pull that kept him there was not survival, it was proximity. The girl started whispering to the owl before she slept. Not prayers, not requests. Small statements, as if continuing conversations that had never finished. I did okay today. I didn't cry in math. I remembered the thing you told me about breathing. The owl listened. Inside the borrowed body, something human tightened. Not pain, not joy, but pressure. He remembered those moments vividly, sitting on the edge of her bed, teaching her how to slow her breathing when panic made her chest ache, telling her it was temporary, that she was safe. Now he could only watch her practice alone. Some nights she fell asleep faster after whispering. Other nights she stared at the owl as if daring it to disappear. It never did, until one night it almost did. A storm rolled in unexpectedly, heavy and sudden. Wind battered the trees, rain streaked the glass, thunder rattled the house hard enough to wake her mother down the hall. The girl jolted upright in bed, heart racing. She looked instinctively toward the window. The branch was empty. Panic surged faster than thought. She scrambled out of bed, pressing her hands to the glass, scanning the darkness beyond the rain. "Don't," she whispered, voice breaking. "Don't go." Outside, the owl clung to a lower branch, wings spread wide against the storm. The rules pressed harder now, insistent, reminding him that staying visible through chaos invited consequence. Borrowed bodies were not meant to intervene in moments of danger, but he stayed close enough to see her. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room and the owl simultaneously. For a fraction of a second, reflection vanished. There was no glass, no separation, just recognition. The owl lifted one wing slightly, not to signal, not to approach, but to hold balance against the wind. The girl saw it. She stepped back slowly, breath shaking, but relief washing over her face. She returned to bed and pulled the blanket around herself, eyes never leaving the window. The owl endured the storm. By morning, exhaustion weighed heavily on the borrowed body. Something within him shifted, not weakening, but thinning. Borrowed time did not stretch indefinitely. Recognition accelerated the process. He understood now that this arrangement had an endpoint. The girl noticed the difference before he did. The owl arrived later the next night. Not much, 3 minutes, maybe 4. But the difference unsettled her. She checked the clock. She sat up straighter. When he finally appeared, she smiled, then frowned. "You're late," she whispered. The owl remained still. Inside, the rules tightened further, not as punishment but as correction. Borrowed bodies were meant to finish something specific, not linger indefinitely. His presence had crossed from observation into attachment. That carried cost. The girl slept eventually, unaware of the calculation unfolding just beyond her window. The owl stayed until dawn again, but the effort felt heavier. This was no longer about watching. Something was coming that required choice, and borrowed bodies were only granted one. The girl began leaving the window slightly wider open. Not enough for the cold to matter, not enough for her mother to notice. Just enough to change the way the air moved between inside and outside, as if widening the space between them might make the owl's presence feel less distant. She didn't question why she did it. The impulse felt older than logic. At school, she started drawing again. Not pictures meant to be shown, small sketches tucked into the margins of notebooks, branches, circles for eyes, feathers suggested with careful lines. Teachers assumed it was distraction. They didn't see the pattern forming. At night, the owl watched her draw from the branch, recognizing shapes long before they became clear. Memories surfaced not as images, but as habits. The way she held a pencil too tightly, the way she erased holes through paper when uncertain. He remembered correcting that. He remembered failing to. Borrowed bodies carried memory unevenly. Some details arrived sharp and immediate. Others slipped away as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Names were hardest. Faces blurred at the edges. Emotion, however, remained intact. Love did not fade. It pressed harder. The girl began speaking to the owl more directly now. No longer half-asleep murmurs, but quiet conversations whispered into the night, careful not to wake the house. "I think Mom is pretending she's okay," she said one night, knees pulled to her chest. "I don't know what to do when she cries," she said another. "I miss you even when I don't remember what your voice sounded like." That one hurt differently. Inside the owl's chest, something constricted. Voice was gone. Sound was gone. Even if the rules allowed speech, the body could not produce it. The limitation was physical as much as spiritual. Borrowed bodies were not vessels for reunion. They were placeholders. The girl didn't expect answers. She spoke because speaking felt necessary, because silence felt heavier when shared. Some nights she fell asleep mid-sentence, head resting against the window frame, breath fogging the glass in shallow bursts. The owl stayed until her breathing slowed. Time thinned. The arrival hour drifted again, 2:19, then 2:22, each shift barely perceptible but cumulative. The girl noticed every change. She began checking the window more often before sleeping, anxiety tightening her chest. "You're not leaving, right?" she whispered once. The owl remained still. That stillness was no longer reassurance, it was limitation. Borrowed bodies were bound by thresholds. Recognition shortened duration. Attachment accelerated decay. He felt it now, not as pain, but as exhaustion layered beneath instinct. He could stay, but not forever. The storm had marked something irreversible. The girl had seen him clearly. The borrowed body had reacted. The rules had tightened accordingly. One night, he did not arrive at all. The branch remained empty long past 2:30. The girl sat upright, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. She whispered his name once, then again, louder, as fear edged into her voice. Nothing answered. She waited until dawn, refusing sleep, staring until her eyes burned. When morning came, she felt hollow rather than tired. That day she cried openly for the first time in months. Her mother held her, confused by the sudden intensity, unaware that the girl was grieving, something no one else knew had existed. That night the owl returned, later than ever before. 3:07 a.m. The relief hit her so hard she gasped, hand flying to her mouth. She scrambled out of bed and pressed her forehead against the glass, eyes wide. "You came back," she whispered. The owl perched carefully, wings folding with effort. The act felt heavier now. Balance required focus. The borrowed body responded slower than before. He understood then what this phase meant. Absence was no longer accidental. It was preparation. Borrowed bodies did not vanish suddenly. They receded. They tested separation. They forced adjustment. The rules did not explain this process. They enforced it. The girl sensed it too. She didn't accuse the owl of leaving. She didn't ask why. Instead, she changed the way she spoke. "If you have to go," she whispered one night, voice trembling, "just don't disappear without saying something." The owl tilted its head slightly, not enough to break the rules, enough to acknowledge the request. That small movement carried consequence. A pressure pressed inward again, stronger this time. The body shuddered once before stilling. The girl saw it. She covered her mouth, eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I won't make you do that again." The owl remained until dawn, but the cost lingered. Borrowed bodies were not meant to be comfort. They were meant to prepare someone for absence, and preparation, once begun, could not be reversed. After that night, the girl stopped asking the owl to stay. The change was subtle but deliberate. Her whispers no longer carried urgency. She spoke more carefully now, as if choosing words that would not pull too hard on something already fraying. She understood, instinctively, that wanting could be dangerous. So instead of asking questions, she began telling stories, small things at first, what she ate for lunch, a joke a classmate told that didn't make sense, how the math test felt easier than she expected. These weren't confessions. They were offerings, pieces of a life continuing forward. The owl listened. Inside the borrowed body, memory rearranged itself around her voice. Not images, not timelines, just emotional alignment. Pride surfaced without expression, relief without release. The awareness that she was adapting, not collapsing, that mattered. The arrival time stabilized again, though later than before. Around 2:45 a.m. now. The girl stopped checking the clock. She learned to feel when the owl was near instead. A shift in the air, a pressure behind her eyes, the sense of being accompanied rather than watched. Borrowed bodies could not be felt physically, but they could be sensed. One night, she brought her pillow to the window and sat on the floor, knees drawn in, back against the wall. The owl watched her arrange herself with the same care she once used to prepare for sleepovers before everything changed. "I think I'm going to be okay," she whispered, not confidently, but honestly. The owl remained motionless. The words landed heavily. This was the moment borrowed bodies were meant to reach, the point where presence no longer served survival but memory did. He felt the boundary thinning again, not abruptly, but with clarity. This time it didn't frighten him, it felt like alignment. The girl closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the wall. She didn't fall asleep immediately. She stayed awake, breathing slowly, as if memorizing the sensation of not being alone. Outside, dawn crept closer than usual. The owl's grip on the branch loosened slightly, not from weakness, but acceptance. Borrowed bodies were temporary by design. Their purpose was not to replace what was lost, but to ensure something remained intact afterward. In this case, it was resilience. That night, something changed in the house as well. The girl's mother woke unexpectedly, drawn by a sound she couldn't identify. She stood in the hallway, listening, sensing something unresolved. When she passed her daughter's room, she paused. The door was open. Her daughter was asleep on the floor, curled near the window, face calm in a way she hadn't seen in months. The mother hesitated, then gently lifted her, carrying her back to bed. She didn't look out the window. If she had, she would have seen the owl one last time, still, watching, waiting for the moment to leave. The owl did not return the following night. The girl woke at 2:45 a.m., automatically, eyes opening before thought. She turned toward the window and felt the absence immediately, not as loss, but as space. She sat up slowly. No panic came. She waited. Nothing arrived. Instead, memory surfaced. Not of feathers or eyes or branches, but of hands brushing hair away from her face, of breathing exercises whispered in the dark, of someone sitting beside her bed simply because she needed it. She lay back down and slept until morning. Days passed, weeks. The girl kept drawing, but the owl no longer appeared in her sketches. Branches gave way to open sky. The circles softened, feathers dissolved into lines that suggested movement rather than stillness. She stopped whispering at night, not because she forgot, because she didn't need to anymore. Some borrowed bodies complete their purpose without farewell. They leave no sign, no explanation, no proof. Only a shift in trajectory that cannot be traced back to its origin. The girl grew, quietly, uneventfully, successfully. Years later, she would remember the owl not as something that watched her sleep, but as something that stayed long enough to let her learn how to sleep alone again. And somewhere beyond borrowed bodies, beyond rules and limits and thresholds, that was enough. Time passed differently once the owl was gone. Not faster, not slower, just unobserved. The girl didn't mark the nights anymore. She stopped waking automatically in the early hours, stopped measuring darkness by expectation. Sleep returned to being what it had once been, unconscious, unmonitored, uninterrupted. At first, that absence felt like relief. Then it felt like silence. During the day, life filled the space the owl had occupied. School projects accumulated, friendships shifted. Her mother smiled more often, though the smile still arrived cautiously, as if unsure whether it was allowed to stay. Grief hadn't disappeared. It had rearranged itself. The girl no longer searched the window at night, but sometimes, while brushing her teeth or packing her bag in the morning, she would pause suddenly, caught by a feeling that something had just left the room. Not loss, recognition. She started volunteering at the local library after school. The work was quiet, repetitive, comforting. Shelving books felt grounding in a way she couldn't explain. The librarian, an older woman with a gentle voice, once commented on how carefully the girl handled fragile pages. "You act like the books can feel it," she said. The girl shrugged. "Maybe they can." At night, the branch outside her window remained empty. Leaves shifted, wind moved through, other birds landed briefly and left again. Nothing stayed. That consistency mattered. Borrowed bodies were meant to depart cleanly, but something else lingered. On certain evenings, just as dusk settled, a different owl appeared farther down the street, not on her branch, not close enough to watch her sleep, just present, peripheral, non-intrusive. The girl noticed it once. Then she stopped looking. That was the final adjustment. Borrowed bodies did not always vanish completely. Sometimes they transitioned into distance, becoming part of the background rather than the focus. Presence softened into symbol. The girl didn't need protection anymore. She needed continuity. One afternoon, while helping her mother clean out a hallway closet, she found a box tucked behind winter coats. Inside were notebooks, old photographs, loose papers tied together with string, her father's handwriting. She froze. Her mother hesitated, watching her carefully. "You don't have to go through that now," she said. "I want to," the girl replied. They sat on the floor together, reading quietly. Notes about work, lists, small observations written in the margins of pages, nothing profound, nothing dramatic, just evidence of someone paying attention. The girl noticed something immediately. He wrote everything down, things she'd forgotten she ever said, questions she'd asked once and never repeated, small fears that never made it into memory. He had been watching long before he ever left. That night, she placed the notebooks back into the box and slid it under her bed. Not hidden, just nearby. She slept without dreams. Outside, the branch remained empty. Borrowed bodies had no further reason to return. Elsewhere, beyond the rules, beyond the trade of proximity for silence, the father no longer needed to observe. The task was complete. The attachment had shifted from presence to memory, from guarding to trust. Borrowed bodies do not stay to witness success. They leave when someone no longer needs watching. The girl's life unfolded quietly after that. She graduated. She moved cities. She learned how to be alone without being lonely. She developed a habit of noticing small details, how rooms felt when entered, how people breathed when anxious. She carried those instincts forward. Years later, while visiting a friend in a rural town, she saw an owl perched on a fence post at dusk. It didn't look at her. It didn't move. It didn't stay long. She smiled anyway. Not because she believed it was him, but because she understood what it represented. Some love does not ask to be remembered. It only asks to stay long enough to make forgetting unnecessary. The girl's understanding of the world shifted without announcement. It wasn't belief. She didn't decide that spirits returned as animals, or that death allowed for second chances. What changed was subtler. She began to accept that some forms of care exist without explanation, that not every presence needs a name to be real. That acceptance followed her into adulthood. She studied quietly, chose paths that allowed observation without intrusion. She became good at noticing what others overlooked. Tension in a room, hesitation in a voice, the moment when someone needed space instead of reassurance. People described her as attentive. They didn't know how accurate that word was. There were nights, rare ones, when sleep arrived late, and she found herself standing by a window again, not searching, just breathing. On those nights, she felt the faintest echo of what once had been. Not eyes watching her, but something aligned with her rhythm. It never scared her. Borrowed bodies leave traces not in memory, but in behavior. The girl, now a woman, carried that trace forward in the way she treated others. She stayed when things were uncomfortable. She noticed when people went quiet. She learned when to remain and when to step back. Those instincts weren't inherited. They were learned through proximity. Her mother aged gently, grief softening into nostalgia. They spoke about the father sometimes, without sharp edges. His name became part of ordinary conversation again, no longer protected or avoided. One evening, sorting through old photographs together, her mother paused at an image of him, standing beneath a tree, sunlight breaking through leaves above his head. He liked quiet places, her mother said. He said they made listening easier. The woman nodded. She didn't explain why that sentence felt complete. Years later, after her mother passed, she returned to the house one final time. The branch outside the bedroom window had grown thicker. Leaves clustered differently now. The room itself felt smaller, as if it had served its purpose and released it. She slept there that night. No owl appeared, no presence arrived. And that was right. Borrowed bodies are not meant to follow forever. They appear to stabilize a moment, not define a lifetime. Their work ends when attachment no longer binds survival. In the early morning, just before leaving the house for the last time, she stood at the window and opened it fully. Air moved freely through the room. Nothing lingered. She whispered thank you, not to a bird, not to a spirit, but to the part of her life that had been guarded when she couldn't guard herself. Outside, somewhere far beyond the house, an owl lifted from a tree and vanished into the sky. Not near enough to be seen, not close enough to be mistaken. Just part of the world. Borrowed bodies return nothing to those they protect. They take nothing either. They exist briefly, fulfill a single function, and dissolve back into anonymity. That is their mercy. The woman closed the window and turned away. She did not look back, because borrowed bodies do not ask to be remembered. They ask only that someone lives well enough to make their presence unnecessary. She didn't notice the pattern until she was back inside the house alone, not as a teenager, not as a grieving child. As an adult, standing in her childhood bedroom with a keyring in her hand, the air smelling faintly of dust and old fabric, the walls stripped of anything personal because the house was about to be sold. Her mother's funeral had been small, quiet, practical. The kind of goodbye that happens when everyone has already been saying goodbye slowly for years. Now there was paperwork. The woman had come back to sort through what was left. It was the third drawer that stopped her. She pulled it out and found a thin wooden box she'd never seen before. It wasn't locked. It didn't look hidden. It looked placed, like someone had wanted it discovered, but not touched too early. Inside were 3 items. A photograph of her father, holding her when she was very small, his face half-lit, eyes tired but peaceful. A folded letter in his handwriting, the paper yellowed at the edges, and a sheet torn from one of his old notebooks, covered in tight, organized writing with a simple ink sketch in the corner, an owl on a branch. Her throat tightened before she even read the first line. The letter wasn't dramatic, no poetic goodbye, no apologies dressed as wisdom. It was direct, the way he had always been when he wanted something understood clearly. If you're reading this, it means your mother is gone, and you're standing in this room again. I wish I could tell you I'm sorry for leaving you too early, but I'm going to tell you something more useful than that. She sat on the edge of the bed without realizing she'd moved. The letter continued. There are things your mother never knew. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't want her carrying my fear. If anything ever happens to me, don't assume it was an accident just because people say it was. Her hands went cold. The official story had always been clean. Car crash, night rain, a driver who fell asleep, no villain, no mystery, a tragedy that fit neatly inside a news cycle. But the letter didn't fit. I kept evidence in a place you won't look unless you're pushed to it. You'll know it's time when you start seeing what you aren't supposed to see. She swallowed hard. The sheet from the notebook trembled as she lifted it. The handwriting was his, unmistakable. Numbers, dates, a list of names she didn't recognize, and beneath it, one line circled twice. Don't trust the kind man with the blue tie. It felt absurd in her hands. Too specific, too strange, like a warning from a life she didn't remember living. At the bottom of the page was an address. Not a house, a storage facility across town. She stared at it until her eyes hurt. Then she remembered something she hadn't thought about in years. The social worker who had handled her father's estate. The man who'd spoken softly, smiled too easily, and told her mother, "He kept everything in order. You'll be fine." Blue tie. Her pulse quickened. She stood up and walked to the window. The branch outside was still there, thicker now, older. Leaves gathered in a different shape. The streetlight still cast the same dull cone of light. No owl sat there, but the memory of it pressed into her chest like a hand. She didn't know what she believed. She didn't even know what she wanted to believe, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Her father had expected this moment. He had planned for it, and somehow, through time, through silence, through a borrowed body watching a child sleep, he had kept the thread intact long enough to lead her here. The storage facility was 15 minutes away. She didn't call anyone, not friends, not family, not an attorney. She drove with the letter on the passenger seat, eyes scanning every rear-view reflection, feeling ridiculous for it and unable to stop. At the facility, the office clerk asked for her name. She gave it, voice steady, and watched the clerk type. A pause, then another. The clerk frowned slightly, as if surprised by what he saw on the screen. "Someone already has access to that unit," the clerk said. Her stomach dropped. "Who?" The clerk looked up. "A man named—" She didn't let him finish. "Does he wear a blue tie?" she asked, and hated how certain her voice sounded. The clerk blinked. "How would you—" She leaned forward. "Has he been here recently?" The clerk hesitated, then nodded. Yesterday. Her mother had died 3 days ago. She stood very still, hearing only the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Her father had warned her, and now the warning had become a clock. The clerk slid a clipboard across the counter, his movements suddenly cautious. "I'm not supposed to give out details," he said, lowering his voice. "But, yeah, He came by yesterday afternoon, said he was handling estate matters, had paperwork, everything looked official. Of course it did. The woman nodded slowly, forcing her breathing to stay even. Panic wouldn't help. Confusion wouldn't either. Whatever her father had anticipated, he'd also trusted that she would recognize when it was time to act. "Which unit?" she asked. The clerk hesitated again, then glanced toward the hallway of metal doors stretching into shadow. "Unit 317. She thanked him, took the key he offered, and walked alone down the corridor. Each step echoed too loudly. The air smelled of dust and oil. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering at irregular intervals. Unit 317 sat near the end. The lock was intact, no signs of forced entry. That didn't reassure her. The man with the blue tie wouldn't need force. He would use permission. The key turned easily. Inside, the unit was smaller than she expected. A single metal shelf, 2 plastic bins, 1 battered suitcase pushed against the back wall. Her chest tightened. The first bin contained documents, copies of emails, printed bank statements, legal correspondence. She scanned them quickly, recognizing patterns even before meaning fully formed. Her father hadn't died in a simple accident. He had been investigating something: irregular transfers, shell accounts, names repeated across different organizations, and one name circled again and again in the margins, always accompanied by a small, angry slash of ink. The man with the blue tie. The second bin held a flash drive taped to the lid with a note in her father's handwriting. "If they get this before you do, it won't matter anymore." Her hands shook as she pocketed it. Then she turned to the suitcase. It was heavier than it should have been. She knelt, unzipped it slowly, and froze. Inside were not clothes. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them, each one labeled by date, each one filled with observations, not about money, not about systems, but about her. Her sleeping patterns, her anxiety spells, her questions. And one recurring note written in the margins over and over again: "Watch until she can watch herself." Tears blurred her vision. He hadn't just been protecting himself. He had been protecting her. Footsteps echoed at the far end of the corridor. She froze. The sound stopped, then resumed, closer now. A voice called out casually, too casually. "Hello? Anyone in here?" Her pulse slammed in her ears. She didn't hesitate. She zipped the suitcase shut, dragged it toward the door, and pulled it just far enough to retrieve one final item from beneath it. A folded sheet taped to the floor. Another note. "If he's coming now, it means I'm right." The footsteps stopped directly outside the unit. A shadow crossed the threshold. She stood, heart hammering, and turned just as a man stepped into view, tall, calm, impeccably dressed, blue tie. He smiled when he saw her, the smile of someone used to being trusted. "You must be his daughter," he said gently. "I was hoping we could talk." She met his eyes without flinching. "We will," she said, "with the police." The smile faltered just slightly. "Enough. You don't understand what you're holding," he said, stepping forward. "Your father was confused, paranoid near the end." She lifted the suitcase. He was precise. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder. The man's eyes flicked toward the sound. Calculation replaced charm. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "You did." He stepped back as the sirens drew closer, his confidence dissolving into irritation, then anger. Outside, red and blue lights flooded the corridor. She didn't look at him again. As officers escorted him away, one of them asked her softly, "How did you know?" She thought of a branch outside a bedroom window, of silence that wasn't empty, of a presence that stayed until it wasn't needed. "My father," she said simply. He watched. That night, back at the house, she stood at the window one last time. The branch was empty. And that was okay, because borrowed bodies do not reveal the truth themselves. They wait long enough for someone else to do it. The arrest did not feel like an ending. It felt like alignment. The woman spent the next several days moving between police interviews, legal offices, and quiet stretches of waiting where nothing happened except thinking. The evidence her father had left behind unraveled a network larger than she expected: financial manipulation hidden inside non-profit structures, quiet coercion masked as assistants, men who looked harmless because they preferred it that way. The man with the blue tie was not alone. He had simply been careless. When investigators asked how her father had known where to look, she didn't explain everything. She spoke about notebooks, about patterns, about instinct sharpened by attention. That answer satisfied them enough. Some things were not meant for reports. At night, she returned to the house and slept in her childhood room again. Not out of nostalgia, but necessity. The place anchored her while everything else shifted. She slept deeply now. No waiting, no scanning, no expectation, and yet on the third night after the arrest she woke just before dawn with the same familiar sensation she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, presence. She sat up slowly and turned toward the window. The branch was empty, but the air felt settled in a way it hadn't before, like something had arrived, checked its work, and left again without announcement. Borrowed bodies do not linger for gratitude. They leave when balance is restored. The following weeks moved quickly. Statements were filed, accounts frozen, charges expanded. The story reached the news in fragmented pieces, never the full picture, never the part that mattered most. Her father's name appeared briefly in articles as a private citizen who raised concerns before his death. That was enough. She donated the notebooks to investigators, except for one. The one labeled simply with her name. That one stayed with her. Inside, the last page was blank. He hadn't written an ending. He'd trusted her to live it. One afternoon, while packing the last of the house, she found the moon-shaped nightlight in a box. The plastic was yellowed now, the switch stiff. She turned it on anyway. The glow filled the room softly. She smiled, not because it reminded her of being watched, but because it reminded her of being held without being touched. Outside, dusk settled over the street. Somewhere far beyond the house, an owl lifted from a tree, not near enough to be seen, not close enough to be mistaken. It flew without destination. Borrowed bodies are not rewards. They are bridges. She closed the window, turned off the light, and carried the nightlight downstairs. Some things no longer belonged to the dark. Life did not return to normal. It moved forward differently. The woman sold the house within 2 months, not out of urgency, but clarity. The place had served its purpose. It had been a shelter, a witness, a bridge between what was lost and what had been preserved. Holding on to it any longer would turn memory into weight. She kept very little. The notebooks, the letter, the nightlight, everything else was released. The legal process unfolded without her constant involvement. Prosecutors didn't need her intuition anymore. They had records, transactions, corroboration. The man with the blue tie stopped smiling in court. Others followed him into visibility, men whose authority had protected them until it didn't. The system corrected itself slowly, imperfectly. That was enough. What surprised her most was not relief, but lightness. Not happiness, exactly. Space, the kind that allows breathing without checking for something missing. She moved to a smaller apartment in a different city. Took a job that required patience more than ambition. Her co-workers described her as steady, reliable, someone who listened without interrupting. They trusted her quickly. She never asked why. Some nights, when exhaustion kept her awake, she stood by her new window. There was no familiar branch here. No streetlight casting the same dull cone. The skyline was different, louder, less forgiving, and yet she felt no loss. Borrowed bodies do not imprint location. They imprint capability. She had learned how to notice danger without panic, how to wait without freezing, how to recognize when presence had done its work and absence was the next step forward. Those lessons stayed. Years passed. One evening, walking home from work, she noticed a child standing alone on a sidewalk, eyes fixed on a darkened storefront. The child wasn't crying, just still, uncertain, carrying too much silence for someone that small. The woman slowed. She didn't rush, didn't startle. She approached the way someone once had approached her, carefully, without assumption. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked gently. The child nodded. "My mum. She said she'd be back." The woman glanced at the street. Too quiet, too late. She stayed. They waited together. She told the child nothing comforting or false. She simply remained, present enough to share the space. When the mother finally returned, breathless, apologetic, the woman stepped back without explanation. No credit, no lingering. That night, walking home, she understood something fully for the first time. Borrowed bodies had not been about her father staying. They had been about teaching her how to stay for others when it mattered, and how to leave without guilt when it didn't. At home, she turned on the moon-shaped nightlight and set it on a shelf by the door. Not plugged in, just there, a reminder. Outside, somewhere far beyond streets and buildings, an owl passed through the night unnoticed. It did not pause, it did not circle, it did not watch. Its work was long finished. Borrowed bodies do not seek continuation. They dissolve once their purpose has transferred. The woman closed her door, locked it, and turned toward the life she was actively choosing, unwatched, unguarded, and fully her own. And for the first time, that felt complete. This was never a story about reincarnation in the way people expect it to be. It wasn't about a man returning to live again. It wasn't about messages delivered or miracles revealed. It was about presence that lasts just long enough to transfer strength. Borrowed bodies do not come to stay. They come to stabilize a moment that would otherwise collapse under loss. They observe, they endure, and they leave without announcement once the balance shifts. The father in this story did not return to be recognized. He returned to make sure something fragile survived long enough to stand on its own. And when that work was done, he did what borrowed bodies are meant to do. He disappeared. What remained was not proof, not belief, not certainty. What remained was capability. The ability to notice danger early, the ability to stay calm when things begin to unravel, the ability to leave without guilt when staying is no longer necessary. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Borrowed Bodies. This channel explores quiet returns, lives that briefly inhabit borrowed forms to finish something left undone. And if you're listening right now, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. These stories move differently across cultures, but the patterns repeat everywhere. Some love doesn't need to be remembered. It only needs to stay long enough to teach someone how to live without being watched.